5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Imagine if Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had arrived on the moon on July 20th, 1969, and had found an axe-wielding 79-year-old woman selling candy bars and homemade pop.
That's kind of unexpected.
I'm just trying to give you some sense of the absolutely magical feeling that paddlers in the Boundary Water Canoe area experienced when they discovered the root beer lady. Welcome to Minnesota Historia. I'm Haley, your guide to the root beer lady. This is the Boundary Waters Canoe area, a 1.1 million acre wilderness on the Canadian border in northern Minnesota. And this is Dorothy Molter, the Boundary Waters' last permanent resident. She lived here for more than 50 years. Now she has her own brand of root beer, her own museum, and a photo with Julia Roberts. Julia's on the left. She was on a youth group canoe trip to the Boundary Waters, and she wasn't famous yet, but Dorothy was. Here's how she got started.
I come up here in 1930 for the first time with my dad, my mother, my uncle. That should be okay. Of course, this kind of country was all new to me, coming from the city and never going out to picnics or nothing. I was never in a canoe till I come up here.
Dorothy's family spent summers at the Isle of Pines resort on Knife Lake. This is where Dorothy's cabin was.
After about 3 or 4 summers, I decided I wanted to see what it was like in the wintertime. So I made a trip up here.
Dorothy was fascinated to see how people lived year-round at the edge of civilization.
It was mostly all men when I first come up here. I was listening to the guys talking about cutting ice, putting up ice. And of course, we used some of their ice in the summertime, but we had no idea how they got it up here.
With great difficulty.
I used to like to stand by and watch those fellas. Now the main thing we need ice for is for keeping the root beer cold.
Dorothy had trained in Chicago to be a nurse. But in 1934, she moved to the Isle of Pines resort for good. In 1948, owner Bill Berglund died and left the resort to Dorothy. The U.S. Forest Service offered to buy the resort immediately. She politely declined. In 1949, Harry Truman banned float planes, and in the mid-1950s, she started making her own root beer because she couldn't bring it in via float plane.
I used to have pop up here, but after the planes quit flying, well, then I discontinued it because I wasn't about to pack pop over the portages. So I had so many root beer bottles on hand. We got the idea of making root beer.
In 1964, Congress passed the Wilderness Act, and Dorothy was forced to sell a resort to the U.S. Forest Service. They agreed to let her stay on the property, temporarily, but she never left. It can be hard to visualize how remote the Boundary Waters truly are. Dorothy lived 15 miles from the nearest road. Motorized boats were restricted in 1978, snowmobiles in 1984. It took 5 overland portages just to get home. A portage is whenever you have to carry your canoe between bodies of water, like this guy. I always volunteer to carry the paddles.
Ely, this is Knife Lake.
Knife Lake, Ely, go ahead.
I have a message for Jerry.
It's worth noting that the Forest Service actually liked having Dorothy in the Boundary Waters. I mean, who wouldn't? Who doesn't like root beer? Who doesn't like having a nurse in the middle of your giant, dangerous forest?
Okay, Dorothy, I can give them the message.
Yeah.
They eventually gave her a 2-way radio and called her a volunteer in service. When she wasn't nursing, or gardening, or feeding her ducks, or visiting her friends who stopped by, Dorothy was making her root beer and then giving it away. Of course, she left out a tip jar for donations. It was the same way she'd run a resort, just barely legal. Dorothy's secret recipe wasn't really a secret either. She'd buy syrup from A&W or the grocery store in Ely, then add sugar and yeast. The water came from Knife Lake, but she had to carry everything else to her island. In fact, she was once attacked by a bear while portaging candy bars. No, not that bear. This bear came from behind the bushes and ripped the pack right off her back. She tracked it down later. The bear was picky. Didn't even eat all the candy bars. Only in the Boundary Waters could you buy candy bars in the middle of the woods with teeth marks on them, and you'd be happy about it. This is Jess Edberg, the executive director at the Dorothy Molter Museum in Ely, Minnesota. She knows a lot about Dorothy.
And this is where Dorothy would sell root beer out of.
And the former Isle of Pine Resort. I like to call her the root beer lady.
At our museum, we have 3 of Dorothy's historic cabins. After Dorothy's passing in 1986, a group of her friends and supporters salvaged what they could from her property up on Isle of Pines. These cabins were dismantled, so log by log, taking them apart, windows out, and they were labeled with metal tags. And then you can put the puzzle back together exactly the way you had it.
You can still buy Dorothy's root beer at the museum and at stores all over northeastern Minnesota. It's always delicious, which is a pleasant surprise to some because Dorothy's root beer was sometimes, how should I put this? Dorothy would occasionally have quality control issues.
It was not uncommon for people to experience what you might call a dud bottle.
The recipe called for her bottled root beer to ferment for at least 3 days and as much as 2 weeks.
Given the fact that Dorothy, especially in the last 10 years of her life, was incredibly busy with visitors coming just to get a bottle of root beer and meet her, she might have 200 people stopping by every day. And it wouldn't have been uncommon for her to mix up a couple crates of root beer on a Tuesday and then have to serve it on a Wednesday afternoon or Thursday morning.
Ferment faster.
If you boys are waiting for root beer, I'm all out of it.
That's okay.
But there's candy in the house.
The fun of it, of meeting Dorothy, of going to Dorothy's Islands, of finding this oasis that had candy bars in the middle of nowhere after days of paddling, mosquitoes, thunderstorms, it was phenomenal. It was more of an experience than the taste of the root beer.
I feel bad that I brought it up.
She can be inspirational for a lot of different communities, especially marginalized communities. She really represents women who are resisting the heteronormative gender roles that are kind of put on women sometimes. She kind of bucked that system and decided to take her own path. And for her to do that in the 30s and 40s is a really big deal.
Other episodes of Minnesota Historia include Duluth's Doomed Winter Olympics, Superior Shipwrecks, the Chief Buffalo Memorial Project, Hunting for Ancient Agates, and The Legend of St. Urho. If you like this video, hit the subscribe button so you won't miss future episodes. If you really like this video, become a member of WDSE and support projects just like this.